The organisers asked us in particular to try and answer 3 questions around developments in the Eurozone at the moment. Whether the current framework is effective, whether it's accountable or legitimate, and how do developments affect out non-Eurozone countries like the UK, and how can countries like the UK play a part in reforms that are ongoing in the Eurozone?
It's hardly necessary to point out that all is not well in Eurozone land. As we speak, Eurogroup ministers are meeting to try to make some progress in tackling the Greek crisis. The Grexit threat seems to be looming ever larger, and no one really knows what Grexit would mean for the Euro project.
I think that the Eurozone is a big success. If you leave aside the current crisis with Greece, if you take into account that we are in an economic difficult situation all over Europe over the past 5 years.
It is important to distinguish between the development of short-term events, in which of course we're all extremely interested on the one hand, and the longer-term developments with Eurozone governance on the other.
We feel particularly strongly that the current economic surveillance programme isn't picking up on some of the real long-term risks, systemic risks for the Eurozone and indeed for the EU as a whole. Risks around demographic issues, an ageing society with inadequate pension systems, around the growing gender inequality that exists across many European countries, and also the growing age inequality that exists as well, with huge levels of youth unemployment.
Although I think the situation in Greece is very serious, and who knows what the consequences will be, not least for the Greek population itself, I think many of the other issues that are prompted by Eurozone governance are rather different. They're, for example, issues about how the evolving political contract, as I would see it, that's embodied in current Eurozone governance would evolve.
I do feel over the longer run we need to think very, very carefully about what's occurring in the Eurozone, and particularly the last 5 years, 7, 8 years, and how they relate to debates around increasing democracy within Europe. And I know those debates are very, very important for people thinking about the referendum at the moment. We will never have an EU that's based on direct democracy. Clearly that's not feasible given the size of the Union. But I think we do need to think very, very carefully about some questions that up until now have been seen as technocratic questions.
I think one of the issues which is very important and does worry the Brits increasingly is this democratic deficiency. We talked about that, of course, and I think what we heard is quite right, that one has to give up a little bit to get some of the benefit. But there is a balance to how much you give up.
We mainly need a new, I would call it a new economic model for the Eurozone and hopefully once for the European Union, and that is that a number of major economic or social reforms that have an impact on the entire Eurozone must be discussed, and I would even say decided, at the level of the Eurozone.
How do we solve that? Some people have said, well, it's through more involvement of bodies like the European and national parliaments. I certainly think there's a role for that, but I don't think that's really enough. I think looking forward to the future, there needs to be a broader range of criteria used in assessing what countries are doing, and we need to listen more to what different actors in different countries are saying.
A single European country, as large as it might be, as important as its history might be, cannot solve these issues on its own. That is true for energy questions, that is true for some dimensions of foreign policy, that is true for climate change, that is true for security issues, where there are a lot of cross-border aspects indeed.
I think it's always important to remember with any system of rules in public policy that rules do need to be embedded in political cultures. So even if you take the example of the German central bank, the Bundesbank, it's very important to remember that although that's often taken as the prime example of an independent central bank, it actually took some time within the German system for that understanding to be really codified and accepted.
You cannot be part of a decision-making process and at the same time wanting to be outside all the time. So the best way not to be marginalized is to participate in the rules.
a number of things that are supposed to work in a certain way just don't. And one is reinventing the rules. And in many ways, so what? I think one should be reinventing the rules. The whole Eurozone creation was done by various countries which decided they wanted to do a certain thing. They set down the rules. What's wrong with looking at them again and looking at them again and again if necessary?
I see one area of reform where we probably can easily agree, and that is that Europe should concentrate on important cross-border aspects, not on details. And it is my understanding that the new European Commission is quite aware of that, because that is a debate in many European countries. So if the Commission will only make proposals on important issues where there is a real need for Europe to act, then I think that is something which we probably share with the UK.
Friends of the UK in Europe say that it brings a very distinctive and constructive voice to discussions. I have to say that's not the tone of voice that I pick up when I listen to UK government ministers who seem to think that actually they've got an economic model that they can tell the rest of Europe how to conduct their affairs.
Whenever a British politician comes back from Europe, they say, we won against the rest of them, we got our way. When actually what happened was they made deals with other politicians who agreed with them on issues, who probably wanted the same thing as them, and they never say that at the end of the process. They say, we beat the Brussels bureaucrats, we beat the Brussels sprouts.
The love-hate relationship between the UK and Europe is so much linked to growth. How well is Europe doing? If it's doing well, we want to be part of it. If it's not doing well, why do we want to have anything to do with it? And unfortunately, the structure and the institutions and how things have developed have proved again and again over the last few years that the framework is simply not fit for purpose.
If the British Prime Minister says that he wants to repatriate some powers, I think we first need to see which powers does the European Union have. And my experience with the UK is that in most of the areas where I want more integration, the UK is not part anyway. The UK is not part of the Eurozone. The UK is not part of the Schengen area of free movement. The UK is not part of the fiscal compact on budgetary discipline. The UK is not part or has an opt-out, sometimes an opt-in areas of justice and home affairs. So I think these are the areas in which I think that Europe has a real added value. The UK has decided, and that it's good right, not to participate in those areas. So therefore, it seems to me that it will be difficult now for the UK to find many areas where they do not want to participate in the future.
It's incredibly important that Britain does engage, that it actually increases its engagement quite substantially. I mean, very, very obviously, the health of the Eurozone and stagnation in the Eurozone has had a massive knock-on impact on our economy. And I have to say, sometimes it's felt like Britain has almost treated this like it's just a Eurozone problem. We will resist anything that we feel treads even slightly on the status quo, not even on sovereignty, but even just on the status quo, when actually some of the measures would be increasing overall sovereignty of the Union by increasing the ability of public policy to do what populations want it to.
I would like to see the British government actually fashion a set of concrete proposals in terms of which it could actually engage in the negotiation with the EU. I think a lot of what currently passes for debate about the EU in the UK is very ill-informed.
So the concern that I have, looking at it from here, desperately wanting to be part, both Britain in Europe and, of course, Greece in Europe, is that what has been going on has destroyed a lot of that belief in the project working. And there is a lot that needs to be done to get it working again. The question for me, of course, is whether Britain is going to have enough time to influence this before the Brits go to vote for the referendum. Thank you.